Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Berkeley Forum. Tonight, we are extremely excited to be hosting Majo Molfino. My name is Cindy Tang, and I'm currently president of the organization, and we have a few introductory remarks before we begin. So first off, if you're willing and able, please fill out our attendance form at the link here. This will allow for us to gather some metrics on this event, and it will also allow for you to opt into our mailing list. And second, if you have any questions for our speaker, please submit them to the tiny URL below, and we will get to those closer to the end of the event. And without further ado, I will invite our event manager for the evening, Aaliyah Bihimino, to the stage.
Hi, everybody. My name is Aaliyah, and I'm so excited to be introducing you all to Majo, who will be speaking this evening. Majo Molfino is a Latinx author, designer, and women's leadership expert. She is the author of Break the Good Girl Myth, published by HarperOne, and host of the HEROINE podcast featuring top female leaders, creatives, and visionaries. Her leadership program, Ignite, guides women to design and share a creative dream with the world. She has a master's in learning, design, and technology from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in cultural studies from McGill University. Her work can be found at majomolfino.com.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Majo, as Aaliyah already said. Thank you so much to the Berkeley Forum for hosting me today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and speak to you all a bit about something I'm very passionate about called Breaking the Good Girl Myth. If you are a boy or a man or a non-binary and listening to this, please feel free to replace girl with whatever word feels most comfortable to you. Really, my expertise and specialty over the years has been working with women and leaders, female leaders. And today I want to talk to you about how to dismantle outdated rules. How do we unleash our power? How do we live a more purposeful life? Many of my clients come to me at a time when they're having a quarter life or midlife crisis. And one client in particular, I remember, her name was Bree. She came into our session completely frazzled. She was only 3 minutes late and she was on the verge of tears. And I said, Bree, what's going on? And she's like, I'm exhausted. I'm working myself to the bone. At the time, she was working at a tech company, a very big tech company. And so we started talking and digging into our coaching session. And I said, well, Bree, how come you're working yourself to the bone? What's going on? And what she answered was very interesting. External validation. And how many of us, right, want to please our bosses, want to please our coworkers or our professors or our colleagues, and we are in the game of chasing the carrot, I like to call it. You know, Bree isn't alone. This is certainly my story. This is me as a 2-year-old in Buenos Aires. These are my parents. And these were, this was in the 1980s when Argentina was going through a dirty war. And my parents were desperate to leave and immigrate to North America. And so I'm a daughter of immigrants. And I think probably many of you are daughters and sons of immigrants as well. And that really brings a kind of complex, a kind of desire to, well, at least in my case, to repay my parents for the sacrifice that they made. So I became a very good girl. You know, I was a straight A student. I won the spelling bee. I did jazz ballet. I did everything you can imagine to make my parents proud, to make my teachers proud, and to excel in life. And you'd think that this would be a good thing, right? Not so much, you know. I think it really lands us in some tricky places. Eventually landed me in a job that didn't resonate with me in my 20s, and I ended up having to quit that job. I landed in another job that I didn't love in my 20s. I had to quit that job. So I was in a cycle of continuing to try to please until I broke out and became my own boss and started my own business and became an entrepreneur as well as an author. So there's some good pretty robust research that shares that girls all over the world outperform boys in school. This is not because of a difference in IQ or intelligence at all. It's actually because girls follow the rules better. They raise their hand, they wait their turn to speak, they turn in their homework, they don't skip class. And so there's something about the way school is designed that really fits well with girls and their self-regulation and makes them perform really well. And again, like I said, you think this would be a good thing, but what I have found in my work is that later on in life, this can lead to problems. This can lead to a sense of burnout, hyperachieving, not having those work boundaries that we need to have the most healthiest and fulfilling life. So I developed this idea of the good girl, right? It's like an armor or a mask. This is an archetype that's sort of a protective mechanism. It's a way that helps us feel safe and loved in the patriarchy, and I'll get into what that is. I'm sure some of you have taken a gender studies class at Berkeley, but it's ultimately disempowering to us, right? So it's a way that we think we can feel safe and loved if I just assimilate and go along with the program. If I'm just good, everything will be okay. But it's actually, in the long run, it catches up to us. The good girl archetype is in opposition to the creative leader. When you think about the qualities of a good girl, it's rule following, making assumptions, conflict avoidant, quiet, approval seeking, all these things I've discussed. But think about the qualities of a creative leader, right? A creative leader, it was John Maida who said, has to be able to navigate ambiguity, has to be able to be curious and experimental, has to take risks. So the qualities of a creative leader and what I think many of us hope to become are actually in opposition to the way that we've been socialized and trained by the major systems of our life, all the way back to family, media and pop culture, school, religion, etc. The biggest system that I discuss in the beginning of my book is the patriarchy. The patriarchy is a social and cultural system that oppresses us and excludes women and those who are non-binary, and those of us who identify as genders other than male. So it's a system that privileges men and males and doesn't privilege people of other genders. And it's been around for a really long time. And it's really important to say that, this isn't about blaming boys or men, and it's not about a group of men. It's about a whole cultural and social system. In fact, boys and men are harmed by the patriarchy just as much as girls and women. That's not my expertise, however, but it is actually a phenomenon that is happening as well. So what are the qualities of the patriarchy? It's a system of oppression. It's inside of you. It's not just something that's outside of you. It has friends. I like to say it likes to team up with other systems, right, to really reinforce itself. So one system that it teams up with a lot is white supremacy. It's very old. It's been around for thousands of years. We're talking about something that started, 2,000, 3,000, some people think 4,000 BC. It's everywhere. And it hurts all of us. Like I mentioned, it hurts people across the spectrum of multiple genders because it's about rigid gender norms and how we're supposed to be, right? What it means to be a good girl, what it means to be a good boy, etc. And it has a lot of messengers. I mentioned the messengers in the last slide. I talk about it in depth in the first chapter of my book, but they are religion, family, school, and pop culture, pop media culture. One of the most oldest stories that we grew up with, think about it, Adam and Eve, right? And think about this story. It's, it's a story of a woman who wants to eat an apple because she's really hungry and she's tempted by it and she goes for her desire. And because of that, all of humanity is banished, right? is cast off and now in the realm of sin. So what does that teach us about what we can go for as women, right? This is an old story that's been around and passed around. And of course, there are many interpretations to this story. You can also read it in a more metaphoric way, not just so literal. But when you take it at face value, it's pretty harsh, right? Woman goes for the apple, she goes for what she wants, and she gets punished. And it's something that has been so entrenched in our Western society for millennia. I started noticing patterns in working with women, in my clients, in podcast listeners, in my podcast guests, as well as friends and family. And with these patterns led me to develop the 5 Good Girl Myths, which are the foundation of the book. And these are core, mostly subconscious, self-sabotaging beliefs and behaviors that hold us back. So they're often very sneaky. We don't realize we're doing them. And they affect our relationships, our career, our well-being. So it's really important to become aware of them and bring some light onto these blind spots. So here are the 5 Good Girl Myths: the myth of rules, the myth of perfection, the myth of logic, the myth of harmony, and the myth of sacrifice. So I'm going to go through each one, and we can talk about them also in the Q&A if you have any questions about them. So the myth of rules, this is the tendency to seek and follow external rules and authority instead of trusting our own desires, needs, and opinions. For every good girl myth, there is a power to reclaim. So in this case, it's our self-authority and purpose. It's really important to note that for the 5 Good Girl Myths, there's actually nothing inherently wrong with any of them. So there's nothing wrong with rules. There's nothing wrong with harmony or any of the Good Girl Myths I'm going to go through. It's really that many of us are defaulting into this instead of choosing it, because in certain contexts, it will make sense to follow rules. In certain contexts, particularly right now, for example, COVID, right? Makes sense, wear your mask, follow the rules. But you're choosing that because you're well educated, you're choosing that because it makes sense. But for those of us who default into this tendency and aren't actually making a choice, is it actually helpful to us? You know, if we're constantly seeking external advice, seeking external expertise and external authority to tell us what to do, is that really going to get us far? So my question to you, if you're listening to this right now, is how does this myth show up in your life? How does it show up in the career choices that you're making? How does it show up in whatever you're studying or deciding to study? How does it show up in your relationships, in your dating life? How might following the rules be limiting you? Here's an example from one of my podcast interviews. Her name is Ann Shen, and she went to art school in New York City, and they had this, all her art professors really valued kind of dark, moody art, you know, with lots of black and you know, avant-garde. And she graduated from that school, and she wanted to design pretty flowers and be decorative. And all her mentors said, no, that's not really art. But she felt strongly that she wanted to design for women, and she saw what was happening on Instagram. She saw what was happening with creative millennials. And so she literally broke away from what she learned in art school and decided to carve out her own path. And on the HEROINE podcast, we talk about this, how Anne carved out her path and broke the good girl myth of rules. And I think she's just a really clear example of how she went against the grain of what she was trained and how she was trained. The myth of perfection, this is my primary good girl myth. It's a tendency to demand perfection in ourselves and others instead of embracing the mistakes and the reality of how things are. So many women fall into this trap, right? Trying to make everything look so effortless. We're trying to be the best mom, the best student, the best daughter, the best friend. It's exhausting. And what do we give up? Our vulnerability and authenticity, and who we really are and who we really want to be. So if you're listening to this, how does the myth of perfection show up in your life? You know, sometimes it can be that you're not taking on an idea or taking a risk because you're afraid that maybe you're going to fail at it, or you're going to get a B- or a C, you know. Maybe you're not going to actually follow your interests because you're afraid you're going to not perform as well as you could. So you're just sticking to the safe coursework or the safe path because you know you can get A+ in them. But is that really going to stretch you? Are you really going to learn? Catherine Finney is another woman I interviewed on the podcast. The reason I bring her up under the good girl myth of perfection is that this woman was an epidemiologist. And then she became a fashion blogger. And then she became a venture capitalist. Isn't that incredible? And now what she does, she founded Digital Undivided, which supports Black and Latinx female entrepreneurs. But what I love about her career trajectory is that in order to make such sharp pivots like that, you have to be able to have a beginner's mindset again and again. You have to be able to break perfectionism. You have to be able to say, I'm okay with not knowing, and I'm gonna prototype my ideas, and I'm gonna try this. And she did, and she's an incredible story of that. The myth of logic. This is one of my big good girl myths. This is the tendency to choose logic over intuition. You know, so many of us get divorced from our bodies. We drop our bodies from a young age. We're taught, you know, forget about your body's needs and just do what your mind wants to do. You know, and we lose access to that intuition, those feelings, that imagination, that empathy, the stuff of that is really a true form of intelligence that we have and we need to tap into in order to make decisions, in order to make good decisions about where we want to go. So many of my clients have tried to make pros and cons lists. Those work to a degree. Eventually, you have to check in with your body and try to read its signals about what feels the best for you in terms of your next steps. So how does this myth show up in your life, right? How are you ignoring your body or ignoring other forms of intelligence you might have, your intuition? Because all these systems, right, really, really bolster, you know, more logical side of our intelligence, right? Critical thinking. And I'm all for that. I think it's wonderful that we're investing so much in STEM, and now we put the A in, so now it's STEAM. So it's good we put the A in. But what about all this other intelligence that we have that comes from other places that can't be so linear and easily explained? One of my other favorite interviews is with Amy Young. This is a woman who's a fashion designer. She's Native American, and she was in corporate for 30 years and had a change of heart and decided, what kind of legacy do I want to leave behind? What do I really care about? What do I want to leave my daughter? You know, she was a single mom as well. And one of the things that she did was she took a road trip and she got really quiet and she eliminated all her inputs. What I mean is she wasn't on her phone. She wasn't watching any TV or listening to any podcast. She just was with the silence of the road and herself and her thoughts and the land. And she said through that process, she was able to hear what she needed to do next, which is go back to her reservation and start a sustainable fashion business, which has been incredibly successful. And now she's doing amazing service work for Navajo children and families, especially during COVID. Another good girl myth I talk a lot about is the myth of harmony. This is the tendency to seek harmony instead of embracing the conflict and confrontation needed for change. So the powers to reclaim here are our voice and our truth. This is really about allowing ourselves to have and leaning into the difficult conversations we need to have in our life. Whether it's that difficult conversation you need to have with your roommate, whether it's with your professor, whether it's with your your fellow bestie, your friend, your girlfriend, your ex-boyfriend, your ex-partner. What is the difficult conversation you need to have that is going to allow you to really share how you feel and think about a certain issue? And I think this is really, really important. So many of us have been trained to hold back our voices. So how does this myth show up in your life, and in what area of your life? Surely you can think of one relationship where, gosh, I didn't speak up, I didn't say the thing I should have said to that person. And how did that affect you? What kind of impact did that have? So there's a term that I use in the book called relationship hygiene. It's like you brush your teeth in the morning, you brush your hair, you take a shower. It's like your relationships also need that kind of hygiene where you are communicating, even over communicating, giving each other feedback, and really letting each other know what's working and what isn't working. A podcast interview I had early on was Eileen Fisher. I interviewed her in my first season when I launched the show. And what was really amazing about her story is she's the youngest of several siblings. I think she's the youngest of 7. And so she grew up quite shy in her family. She had some social anxiety. And when she started Eileen Fisher, she wanted to just be the designer, but Eileen Fisher is a company, it's a business, and it needed to grow. And so she really needed to step up in her business leadership. And in my interview with her, I asked her, what was the most difficult thing in you learning to become a creative leader? And she said, I was so afraid of managing people. I didn't want to get involved in the conflicts. And so for a long time, I avoided those difficult conversations with employees and clients and contractors. And it wasn't until I really had those conversations that Eileen Fisher was able to grow and thrive. And I think it's such a clear example. Here's a creative badass. She's also struggling with this good girl myth, right? Even as a leader. And through leadership training and through working on herself, she was really able to break that and expand her brand and her impact in the world. The final good girl myth I want to talk about is the myth of sacrifice. Again, sacrifice is beautiful in certain contexts. There's nothing wrong with sacrifice, but when we default into it again and again, it can lead us into some problems. So this is the tendency to put other people's needs above your own at the expense of your own self-care and well-being. This is a very deeply entrenched good girl myth. It's also multi-generational. So for a lot of us women, it's how we saw this modeled in our mothers and our grandmothers and how they took care of the family and whether they took care of themselves. Did they have self-care, or was it always for everybody else and everybody else, always taking care of everybody else? And they were the last and bottom on their list. So the powers to reclaim here are our time and energy on a daily basis, which add up to contribution and destiny in the long run. Giving up your time and energy for somebody else again and again on a daily basis might not seem like a big deal. Like saying yes when you really mean no might not seem like a big deal on a Tuesday, but over multiple weeks and months and years, that becomes your destiny. Next thing you know, you look back on your life and you have been spending so much time supporting everybody else's dream and what everybody else wants to do. You haven't focused on what you want and what you need. So that's a big one. So how does this myth show up in your life? How does this myth show up as a student? I think some of us, especially if we're daughters or sons of immigrants, we have inherited a story about sacrifice. And we might need to come back into relationship to that story and say, what part of the story really makes sense for me? And what part of the story doesn't make sense for me anymore? So that's it. Those are the 5 good girl myths that we've internalized. Rules, perfection, logic, harmony, and sacrifice that I believe we really need to break in order to become creative leaders in the world, in order to have the impact and leave the kind of legacy that we want to leave. I would say as women, but also as men, as non-binary people, we're on a collective journey. Think about your parent, right? And think about your grandparent. Think about your great-grandparent and where they were, right? It's amazing to see where you are today. And it's amazing to see that you have a piece to play in all of this and how important it is to do that inner work, to really look at the stories that we've inherited from our cultures, and unlearn some of those key things so that we can come out and really shine with our true gifts. Thank you so much. You can check out my book at goodgirlmyth.com. I'm also on Instagram at Majo Molfino. Feel free to DM me, reach out to me. I would love to hear from you. And I really appreciate this opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Majo, for your fantastic address. And I now love to welcome our moderator for the evening, Jonathan Min, to the virtual stage for our moderated and audience Q&A.
Thanks, Cindy. Thank you, Majo, for coming to speak here today. It's a pleasure to have you here at the forum.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So to begin, you've created various channels for your message of female empowerment, one of the most prominent being your podcast, HEROINE. Given the prevalence of that medium, what challenges, if any, have you faced in creating your podcast?
Such a great question. Some of the challenges I've faced in creating a podcast. Okay, so a podcast is like a mini business. And I didn't think about that when I was starting out, but there's so many steps involved in creating a podcast, from thinking about what guests do you want on, how do you reach out to those guests, but also I had these spreadsheets laid out where I would have my production pipeline, right? And that was like, okay, once I would get a raw interview in, where would it go in the pipeline? It'd have to go to the editor. Then the editor would shoot it back to me, and then I would look at it, right? And then we would publish it, and then we would share it out to guests. So there was like a whole sequence and pipeline that you had to think through. And thinking through that pipeline and getting all the players in place for that, that was a bit of a challenge in the beginning. But once that was smooth running, it was like, okay, the system is down. Now we're good to go.
So your podcast has been quite successful and has been centered around bringing badass women to talk about their roles in leadership, business, and whatever it may be. So how have your conversations, if at all, have they affected your philosophy for women's leadership?
It's a great question. You know, I've had some deep, meaningful conversations with incredible top leaders across many industries. And I'm just humbled by what I can learn through conversation, to be honest. And I think that I really learned, you know, in my presentation, I gave that the qualities of a creative leader versus the good girl archetype. You know, I learned that even leaders are grappling with some old conditioning, right? It's not like once you're this top leader, you have it all figured out and you're done. It's like, actually, you still have a lot that you're working on. And so it was cool to see how a lot of women were trying to bridge into from being more of a good girl into becoming more of a creative leader, and how to do that. Like I gave the example of Eileen Fisher, right? It's like, how do we go from being quiet to actually speaking our truth? How do we go from being afraid of taking risks to taking risks? How do we go with our obsession for control and having to know to embracing ambiguity? These are the shifts that I've learned and through conversation with my podcast guests.
That shift doesn't seem easy, at least for me.
Yeah.
Shifting from one end of being a good girl, or in my case, a good guy, to being a creative leader. So how, if at all, would you recommend one to balance the desire to fulfill social expectations with the pursuit of their creative passions?
How would you balance these?
Yeah.
Because in your question, you're assuming that one has to still fulfill social expectations.
Oh, in that case, how would you?
I don't know. I'm asking you, is that what you believe, Jonathan? Like, do you believe we still need to fulfill? It's okay if you do. I mean.
Oh, I'm asking whether if it still exists. So if, for example, we need to, how if at all would one make the transition from being a good girl or a good boy to fulfilling their passions?
Totally. So one of the things I really talk about in the book, and it's part of my training, is design thinking. Like, I'm obsessed with design thinking. It's something that I learned at the Stanford Design School and in my master's in learning design and technology. And what I love about it is it teaches you a method to take an idea and bring it into form. And so many of us have ideas that we want to put out there, but because we're holding back, or maybe we think we're supposed to do the right path or follow the right career, we're too afraid, we don't actually put it into action. design thinking is a way to de-risk your idea really easily because you can prototype it quickly, iterate, do multiple cycles, and build creative confidence. If you learn the method, it's like 5 steps, which is really awesome, from empathy all the way to prototyping, testing, and then looping back again. And so I'm a really big fan for anyone who's like, oh man, I really want to share my gifts. I really want to get out there, but I don't know, I'm too afraid. Like, I'm a little hesitant. I'm like, really just put a prototype up. And one way to do a prototype is to think about constraints. And one of my favorite constraints is time. What can you create in 10 minutes? So Jonathan wants to make a podcast. He's been thinking about it for a few months. Jonathan, make a podcast in 10 minutes. It's like, oh, okay. I take out my phone and I'm voice noting, right? Hey, this is Jonathan. This is my podcast. And I'm right. And now I'm interviewing my friend who's right next to me. I've made a prototype of an episode. It took me like 10 to 15 minutes, right? And I've actually gained more momentum and creative confidence from doing that than thinking about it for weeks or months. And that's the juice of prototyping, right? And then from that, you can gain feedback. You can throw that little mini episode to Aaliyah and say, hey, Aaliyah, what do you think? What do you think about this is a point of view I'm thinking for how I might interview someone in a short mini-sode on my new podcast. And she might be like, oh yeah, this is cool. This is what I like. This is what I didn't, and get feedback. And so now you're actually engaged in the process, in the creative process of doing it. And you guys are students, so you know this. I'm really talking about project-based learning. But as adults, it's almost like we forget. We're like, even as students, we're obsessed with taking the test, right? Like getting the A+ at Berkeley or Stanford. And it's like, what are you actually learning? Like when I went back to my master's, I took one quarter, I took like 6 or 7 classes, not just because I'm a crazy hyperachiever, but because I was okay with getting C's. So I literally got a C in sacred spaces or whatever I was in. I got a C in this other class because for me, it was more important to learn than to get the grade. That was more important to me. And I'm not encouraging all Berkeley students to get C's. That's not what I'm trying to say here on the Berkeley Forum. But what I'm saying is like, are you actually doing that learning? And that feels, more important and interesting.
So to continue on with our conversation of, for example, how the good girl myth can apply to students, it also has been seen, according to your experience, to apply to people who are much older from a wide range of just ages. So how, if at all, have you seen it impact women at different stages in their lives? And how, if at all, has it been different?
Oh my God, what a good question. Okay, so women in their early 20s, good girl myth of rules, right? Like I just graduated from college. Like I think I'm supposed to. This is what I think I'm supposed. This is the job I think I'm supposed to go into, and the career this is the job that would make my parents really happy. Good girl myth of rules, really strong in your 20s. I would say harmony is also pretty strong when you're earlier on. Usually a woman in her 40s and 50s, by then she can be pretty direct with someone. Not everyone, depends the woman, but I've definitely seen that. Sacrifice is something that you definitely see more in mothers, right? And maybe mothers who at this point, their kids leave the house, right? Their kids go to college. So maybe some of your mothers, y'all. And they're like, what do I do with my life? Like, who am I now that now that my kids are gone? Like, what is my what am I? Okay, I fulfilled role as mother. Like, now what, right? So that I feel like sacrifice comes up later for women in their 50s and 60s. They kind of wake up from it. Logic is something that I haven't seen specific to a developmental phase as much as a type of woman. Like if a woman had intense rigorous academic training, if she was like a smarty and very bookish and really prided herself in being a critical thinker, and it's like now she's like disconnected from maybe that intuition and the stuff that is harder to prove, right? Like harder to prove through what's being measured. And so that's a different profile, I would say. And perfection is really across the board, to be honest. It's one of the most pervasive good girl myths, and I found it to like just cut across all developmental stages and ages, from teen girls, right, who are on social media and the pressure to be perfect, all the way to women in their 60s who are still feeling like they have to be, you know, the best mom, the best this, or have been sitting on idea, like have always wanted to be entrepreneurs, and they're in their 60s now and they still haven't done it. They've delayed that dream for decades. And it's like, when are you going to do it? Now's the time, right? Now's the time to, you know, I hate to say it, but once you're in your 60s, it's like, what do you want to leave behind, right? It's like Amy Young in her podcast, she's having that moment where she's 30 years in the fashion business, corporate fashion business. She has a daughter. She's a single mom. And she's like, what is the legacy I care to leave behind? And that question shifted her entire orientation and in what she chose. It wasn't about should anymore. It was about what she truly wanted to be of how she wanted to be of service.
So continuing on with our conversation of the good girl myth, it has applied in the past as well as the present. But in the 21st century, there has been increased conversation about breaking the rules of gender norms and social expectations. So looking back, how, if at all, do you think that the good girl myth has evolved since your youth?
How has the good girl myth evolved since my youth? Oh my God, I was just talking about this the other day with somebody. I grew up on the 90s and like early 2000s. I don't know about you all, but the movies that I grew up with were so sexist and racist. Like I look back to them now and I'm like some of them I didn't even notice I was watching them, and I didn't even realize that how, you know, how white centering they were, how male centering they were. And just how they didn't have any people of color at all, you know, like they just, and I just like, that was just like what we watched back then. Those were the sitcoms. And so like, I think it's changing now with like what I'm seeing with your generation, Gen Z. Like, I think you guys are way more awake and way more able to see gender fluidity, how it's not so black and white. And that's really exciting to me. Like, I think we're on a precipice of like great change in terms of that. That's, you know, I think millennials like me, like older millennials, like elder millennials, like we're the problem. We grew up on a lot of junk. Like a lot of us need to reprogram some stuff. I think some of you guys have a little bit more fluidity. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I was wondering.
So much of this change in the 21st century could be ascribed to social movements, such as the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement. So how, if at all, have these recent movements impacted how women's issues are discussed in society?
That's a big question. Yeah, wow. Are these student questions now? Or are these your questions, us going back and forth?
We will be getting to the student questions a bit later, but for now, these are mine.
These are your questions. These are your deep curiosities. Yeah. I love it. So good. Yeah, so I think the Me Too movement and what we're seeing is like, this is like an incredible, I mean, obviously I think the Women's March could have been definitely more intersectional for sure. And I think that was like really well said. So let me just read the second to last page of my book, because it's gonna answer your question. If we women can manage the darker aspects and heal the wounds within ourselves, we can free up so much power to create change. We're beginning to glimpse the power of women when we work together and use our voices with movements such as Me Too, Time's Up, and many more to come. I think there are many more to come. Imagine what a critical mass of women who are awake, aligning their inner and outer work could accomplish, especially if we work together. You have a key part to play in this dream. So I just really believe that we're gonna see more movements that are hopefully gonna continue to embolden women to share their gifts, you know? Because my dream is that thousands of women wake up and use their voices and share their gifts, and that we continue, and that we co-design the future together, right? women have a huge stake in how the future is going to play out.
So for these social movements and also future social movements, they need a platform to speak. For example, many of these movements have sort of galvanized and really consolidated their resources on social media. Mm-hmm. So how, if at all, can social media be used as a platform for women to break social pressures and norms?
Wow. I'm not a social media expert, Jonathan, but I will try. I will just throw my hat in the ring with this question and try to answer it. So I think social media is a double-edged sword, as we're all learning. It has benefits and harmful effects, and we're seeing some of the harmful effects on young girls already, like just in terms of body image, in terms of ads. You know, a lot of young girls often can't tell ads from other, you know, like weight loss ads. It's like, oh, it's like an influencer's Instagram account. Like I can't tell that that's a fake account, that that's something that's harmful to my body. So there's and, you know, I think the desire, like I think I mentioned, the desire to be perfect is really affecting young girls right now with Instagram. And like, you know, I'm really focusing on Instagram right now because I think that's where a lot of female entrepreneurs and thought leaders are gravitating towards, especially creative leaders. They're really gravitating towards Instagram. So I see that it has some harmful effects and that we all need to watch out for. And wow, it connects us in ways that are just incredible and beautiful. And I think, you know, when we think about fourth wave feminism, like these tools are an inherent part of these movements. They are allowing us to coalesce in a way that we couldn't before. And so there are trade-offs, you know, it's really hard to, it's hard for me to give my full weight behind something like Instagram because I also see that there are some detrimental effects happening.
So for the sake of time, this will be my last question. So some have argued in many cultures today, women are still expected to take on a more traditional role as a homemaker and are discouraged from working. What, if anything, do you recommend that women who feel trapped by those expectations and norms should do?
I really think women in those expectations can do two things. One is band together. So find other women in your situation that you can communicate with. Because often when we're in any kind of oppressed situation, there could be a sense of isolation. So it's really important for women to reach out and support each other. Instagram is a great way. Like if there isn't anyone, like if you live in a very conservative community, there's no one around you, go on to Instagram, you can find somebody, or go onto social media, you can find someone who has more of your values, who lives in Utah or who lives in, you know, Australia. So that's one. And the second is, you know, I'm more and more of a fan of women learning business. You know, we're going to see a huge uptick of female entrepreneurs in the next 5 to 10 years because of what's happening right now. And so if you're in where you have to be like a traditional homemaker and you can't go to work, you can't leave the house, like how might you make some money on the side? How might you economically empower yourself through business? You know, I think that's really important. Like what's a little business course you can take? What's a side project you can start? What's a way that you can start to carve out some autonomy in that context?
Thanks so much for answering all my questions. So we'll be moving on to the audience Q&A section. So the link will be resent in the chat. So if you have a question, please fill out the form.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it.
No problem. So Omatara asks, what was one of your favorite podcast interviews and how, if at all, do you think it relates to break the good girl myth?
Oh, one of my favorite interviews ever was with a Latinx author. Her name is Isabel Allende. She is the most widely read Spanish-speaking author in the world. Most widely read Spanish-speaking author in the world, Isabel Allende. Please, she's a Chilean author. Please look up her work. She wrote House of Spirits back in the day, but since then, this badass has written like 50 novels. It's just incredible. And one of the things that we talked about is, you know, going back to that good girl myth of logic, like how do you create really good art, you know? And she was a real big fan of, in my conversation with her, of following your instinct and letting it lead you where you need to go. And I think as a writer, especially if anyone's entertaining doing creative writing, like novel writing, fiction writing, poetry, any kind of writing or creating any kind of art, being able to follow that instinct is so key, and not allow the sort of other voices of the mind, you know, well, I don't, you know, you can't do that. Or even like, well, that sounds crazy, right? Like how does one follow one's imagination and instinct without second guessing oneself? And she really goes deep into that in that conversation. It was just so inspiring to me as someone who is creative. So check that one out.
Thank you. So Luna asks, why did you choose to pursue your creative energy through podcasting and women's leadership above other fields?
Well, when I graduated from my master's, I was at a crossroads. I could either pursue a 9-to-5 job as a design researcher at a tech company in Silicon Valley, or I could start my own business. And it became really clear to me that I wanted to start my own business because I wanted autonomy over my time. It was really important for me to have autonomy over my time. I didn't want to be working where somebody was telling me where I needed to be and how much, you know, and I needed to clock in and out, and I just didn't like it. And so it's not that I just didn't like it. I'm far too sensitive for it. I know it sounds strange, but being a highly sensitive person, I need to have autonomy in my day as to when, like I just took a long nap before this. Like literally I took a 30-minute nap before this Berkeley forum, and like being able to have that flexibility and freedom is like, for me, the juice of being an entrepreneur. Of course, that's changed now that everyone's working from home anyways. We all know everyone's napping during the day anyways. So it's all changed. But it was important for me to have autonomy over my time. So I knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so I thought, well, how could I start a business? What could I start a business in? And I knew my strengths were guiding people. I loved design and I loved feminism. And so I merged my interests together to weave like a unique offering. And that's what I encourage all my clients to do. You know, if you have no idea what you want to do in your life, think about how you can intersect your strengths with what you really care about. Like, you know, and you can care about two things. Like, let's say you really care about environmentalism and sports. I don't know, I'm just making it up. And you want to be one of your strengths is communication. It's like, how might you intersect these? Like, think of brainstorm some interesting, original ways to intersect your strengths with your interests.
Unfortunately, for the sake of time, this is all the time we have, and I'm going to cut it here. So
okay.
Thank you again for answering my questions.
I did my best, Jonathan. I did my best. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our president, Cindy Tang, back up to the stage for some closing remarks. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Majo and Jonathan for an incredible moderated portion, as well as for an incredible event. At all of the Berkeley Forum's events, we like to present our speakers with a custom designed poster by a member of our communications team. And so this is tonight's poster designed by Samantha Kim on our team. And as a huge thank you once again, and once we're safe to return to campus, we will send a framed copy of this to you, Majo. But thank you so much again for speaking tonight.
Thank you so much. I love the poster so much. I'm going to share it on my Instagram. Yay! Thank you all.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. And to the audience at home, we do have more events coming up this semester. On October 20th, we have a debate on the sustainability of the gig economy. And on October 29th, we have an event with Sarah Nato-Cheney. And thank you so much again to the audience as well for coming. And if you have any feedback you'd like to submit, please use the tiny URL or the QR code on the screen. And please like us on Facebook, as well as visit our website to keep posted on all of our upcoming events this semester and into the future. And if you are willing and able as well, please consider donating to our Venmo so that we can continue to put on free public events. both virtually as well as in person when we're able to safely return. Thank you so much again for coming out tonight, and we hope to see you at an event soon.